distinguished guests can make their way in as well. Thank you very much. So if you could all please be seated, we'll begin, inshallah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashraf al-anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Your Highness, Sheikh Moza bin Nasser, Chairperson of Qatar Foundation. Your Excellency, Sheikh Hind bint Hamad bin Khalifa Thani, CEO of Qatar Foundation and Chairperson of Hamad bin Khalifa University Board of Trustees, Vice Chairperson of Qatar Foundation. Esteemed guest, President Hasna, Dean Shenturk, and our other deans, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It is my honor to welcome you all to our first Dean's Foresight Lecture of 2023, here at the College of Islamic Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University, wherein, in this series, we tackle the questions of what is, in this talk, we'll tackle the question of what is post-colonialism. The Dean's Foresight Talks are designed to explore contemporary issues through an Islamic epistemological and civilizational lens from prominent thinkers and scholars around the world. Today, we are joined by a most eminent thinker, Dr. Wael Hallaq. Dr. Hallaq is the Avalon Foundation Professor in the Humanities at Columbia University. His most recent writings analyze the problematic epistemic ruptures generated by the onset of modernity and the socio-political historical forces subsumed by it, as well as the intellectual history of Orientalism and the repercussions of Orientalist paradigms. At the heart of this research lies a critique of the paradigmatic structures of knowledge that drive the modern project and that are perpetuated within the contemporary academy. He is the author of over 80 scholarly articles and many books. Among these books, there's most recently, the three that we have here, The Impossible State, Restating Orientalism, A Critique of Modern Knowledge, and Reforming Modernity, Ethics and the New Human in the Philosophy of Abdurrahman Taha. The overarching project of which these books are a part has commanded much attention in the Muslim world and worldwide, in both academic circles and mass media. Restating Orientalism is central to our course at the College of Islamic Studies on post-colonial theory and Islamic thought, which is itself a foundational course within our MA in Contemporary Islamic Studies. Now, what he does within this project is he provides a timely and trenchant analysis that allows us to reimagine the manner in which the field of Orientalism can be directed away from treating Islam as an object to be studied as if it were a relic of the past, towards employing the knowledge obtained through this study to apply the principles of Islam and its intellectual traditions to the crises that confront humanity in the world today. Now, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam provide the ethico-religious foundations upon which humanity can build a more equitable and more holistic world in which the haqa'iq, the realities, and the huquq of all things are ordered and understood in relation to al-haq, God, the real, the truth. Dr. Hallaq's work breaks down the secular humanist paradigms of modernity, which inform us all in many subtle ways, that we may clear the ground and build anew. This is the purpose of the College of Islamic Studies. With the support of Her Highness Sheikha Moza and Her Excellency Sheikha Hind, we can apply the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to contemporary exigencies that affect and afflict all of humanity, remaining true to the Qur'anic principle that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sent rahmatan lil alameen, not as a mercy for Muslims, not as a mercy for believers, not as a mercy just for humanity, but as a mercy for all of the worlds. And that we can apply the Quranic principle that the Quran itself is revealed tibyanan likulli shay. That is, as a clarification for all things. Now, for the format tonight, we will first hear from Dr. Hallaq for about 45 minutes. I'll then open the floor to the audience for the second half of the program. We will close with remarks from Dean Shenturk and hope to wrap up by around 8:30. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Hallaq.
Thank you so much, Jose. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Your Highness, Sheikh Hamouza, Her Excellency, Sheikha Hind bint Hamad bin Khalifa al-Thani, ladies and gentlemen, deans and presidents, it is a great honor to be here today. I am particularly gratified and delighted to be here for many reasons, but for one distinct reason that I just discovered yesterday and today, which I can barely overcome, is that I discovered that the two esteemed and noble ladies here are great intellectual allies. And so I'm going to go back home, very happy man. I shall begin, I do thank also the President Ahmed Hasni and Dean Rajab Shenturk for the wonderful and generous invitation they have extended to me. So what I'm going to do tonight is do what is usually different than when you write an article and come to a conclusion at the end. I'm going to summarize my conclusion first to tell you what are the fundamental blocks of which the talk is made, and then try to unravel the threads so it will become easier to understand my intentions and purposes. The conclusion or the main summation of this message consists of about 4 premises. The first premise is that we should not, however Orientalism has been malevolent and bad and ugly, we should not throw it out totally. We should not throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. I reached the conclusion that this is not a practical solution to the problem. If I have something I am using and it gets broken, I really like to fix it because I know that there are some parts in it that are very usable, and modify it and put it to use instead of just throwing it out and then figure out how do we reinvent another thing. So I would like to save Orientalism with modifications, and this is a great part of what I am suggesting. And you will see my purposes at the end. Actually, they are quite complex. One of the second premise is that through re-engineering Orientalism, we arrive at a narration of Islam, a narration of the identity and history of Islam that is actually useful for the Western audience. Westerners, by re-engineering Orientalism, will begin to learn about Islam in more positive ways. But to be honest with you, this is not my first priority. It is kind of not my essential problem. I want to do this as a kind of a bonus for the deal I am making with this field. Premise 3, through doing 1 and 2, I am proposing that actually Orientalism can become an educator and an instructor of the adjacent academic disciplines in the West. In other words, it becomes what I called in the restating Orientalism, a subversive agent, meaning that it's an agent that militates against a conception, an idea, from the roots, from the bottom. That's why it's subversive. It goes from underneath. It uproots and then recasts, reformulates. The fourth, which is the most important to me, all of them are important, but this is the most important to me, is that by redrafting, reconstituting Orientalism, I am able to offer, I mean, we would be able to offer a narrative about Islam that begins to shape an autonomous, independent, and free way for Muslims to articulate their own history. And Muslim history has not been written yet. It was written by Europe for us. We have no history. We practiced, for example, the Sharia, but we don't have a history of it. Europe comes in the 19th and 20th century and writes the history of the Sharia, transports it to the colonies, and we replicate it and rehash it as if it is the standard knowledge to be accepted, when in fact that history is a colonial history, totally ideological, and in terms of usability for Muslims, it is indeed harmful. But the shocking thing is that most Muslims believe it as if it is the canonical truth. So I want to change all of this. Personally, in terms of my own career in the first 30 years of my, we were talking about how many years I've been doing this. I have, and it's possible, I'm not dreaming here. I think I've been a contributor, among, of course, other scholars, to changing the syllabus of what it means to study the Sharia and Islam in Western universities. So it's not really something, what I'm doing, will take time, what I'm proposing will take time, but taking time does not need to be an act of discouraging. Everything good takes time. Anything that comes easy, we know that, is really not worth doing because it will collapse or be probably harmful. So, it is generally so. So I'm going to talk about now, this is the conclusion. I'm going to talk about the details of it and in terms of conceptualizing and theorizing the issues that I have just outlined in brief. It is generally thought that decolonization is the decolonization of knowledge, is the conscious and intentional withdrawal from a colonial situation. And decoloniality, so the definition goes, is the critiquing of racist notions or the purported universality and hegemonic claims of Western knowledge. We were talking about this. Knowledge that is nowadays global. Decoloniality, the best we have come up so far to answer my own concerns, also remains at the surface. It looks at systems of knowledge, but it has fallen short on looking at what I call the systems of the self. My argument today is that we have not begun to scratch the surface in terms of decolonizing our knowledge, either on the level of systems or certainly, and most definitely, at the level of internality, that is the matter of the government of the self. To decolonize scholarship, I shall argue, means to decolonize much more than the world that we perceive to be outside of us, the systemic world that produces this knowledge. It is much more than the critique of universalist, racist, or hegemonic claims. These are, relatively speaking, superficial things. That's what occupied Said in his Orientalism. But it didn't get us anywhere. Orientalism became even stronger and more vicious. But let me proceed from the particular to the general, from techniques and methods to general principles. First, I propose that in decolonizing scholarship, we need to change the nature of the questions we ask. If language is a representation of thought, then the structure of language must accurately reflect our presuppositions. It is the way we choose our words, in the way we cast and formulate our questions within a particular subjectivity, within a particular subjectivity, that, and in the way we create our mental categories, that decolonization begins. Take, for instance, the modern state as a legal entity. The state has a single legal voice. The law is the law, one law, expressed through its political legal organs, such as the legislative assembly or the like. We take it for granted that a single legal voice is the way to go. It's taken for granted. We don't even understand anything else nowadays. Although, if you think about it carefully enough, one encounters a great difficulty in finding a rationale or rational justification for it. It does not stand to reason that so many people, namely the population at large, can agree on one legal voice, especially in so-called a free society, where everyone seems to feel entitled to his or her own opinion, with their endless individualistic inflections. One way to reason through this univocality, this monotony, is to say that all people are equal before the law and must stand answerable to one and single law that treats them equally. But then we know well that people are not equal, and oftentimes the inequality is radical and extreme. So that particular explanation won't work. In terms of legal and economic power, no reasonable person can think that Microsoft is equal to John Doe on the street. So other than thinking of the hypothetical that we as a society have agreed in order to be able to live together, to give to a sovereign to legislate on our behalf, there is nothing else that can explain this univocality. But then we also all know that this is no more than a supposed social contract hypothetical, the famous social contract of Hobbes and Rousseau, etc. And that no society at large was actually consulted in order to come to this arrangement. These are just theories, explanations in a fictional narrative. Europe did not ask its subjects to agree on something like this and come up with a social contract theory. So we are compelled to conclude that it is the sheer power of the dominating state that rationalizes the univocality of the law, as much as it rationalizes and legitimizes so-called rational bureaucracy. And so we live in this reality, and in fact have lived in it for so long that we no longer question it. And we call this system democratic, a system that expresses the so-called popular will. Always should be in between quotation marks for me. With enough repetition, we begin to believe ourselves, thereby normalizing the abnormal, if not the pathological even. We live in lots of pathologies, by the way. We just think them normal. I don't know how we, when I break them down to people and say, if this happens in a society, in a family, how the members deal with each other, we would send the whole family to therapists. But when we do it on the international level, people think it is normal. And then we turn around to judge, when we do this, we turn around to judge the rest of the world. I mean, not we in the, here, in the Western world in particular, we judge the rest of the world and the history and its history according to these norms. And so we take this coercive picture as a cardinal presupposition and a normative state of affairs. Accordingly, we begin to make certain judgments with a relentless sense of sovereignty. We look, for instance, at the Shari'i phenomenon, in which a salient feature is its plurality of juristic voices. There are, as you know, several legal schools, madahib, and each of these encompassing a multiplicity of opinions, multiplicity of juristic opinions. At first, the multiplicity appears unwieldy, if not downright chaotic, as one time the Supreme Court judge in Egypt told me. It's really total nonsense. It's chaotic in the Sharia. And I was a specialist in it. So I said, okay, what do I tell him? The problem is not asking how the system of pluralistic voices are operated, though the question in itself is, of course, important to ask. The problem creeps on us when we take this phenomenon as the exception, as an anomaly that needs to be rehabilitated in our understanding. We then often proceed to the next explanatory grid by positing that the phenomenon was due to a lack, an absence, a lack of some sort, the lack of centralization, the lack of legal will, the lack of a unified and unifying theory of law, the inability to create discipline and consistency and formal rationality, and so on. In the dictionary of Orientalism, as it is in the dictionary of really Euro-America, the list of lacks in Islamic history is rather long. Islam is always doesn't have a contract, theory of contract, doesn't have this, doesn't have that. We then stop at the characterization that the Islamic legal tradition is one of a jurist law, very famous expression. In turn, characterized by a lack of determinacy and a near chaotic, if not anarchic, application of the law, where a judge in one city adjudicates the same matter quite differently from another judge in another city, though the legal facts of the cases may be identical. This is what Ibn al-Muqaffa saw once, that's in the beginning phase of Islam, and Orientalist scholarship was all too happy to capitalize on this observation. Now, let's try to look at this picture from another perspective, one that is epistemologically more empathetic. One could easily argue, with enormous amount of support, that this is the result of at least two significant features of early Sharia. The first I shall label as nomo-local, while the other as socio-synthesization. That is, an array of considerations pertaining to social and communal sensitivity. In brief, the nomo-local is the way the Sharia evolved, where legislative power was diffused among a large class of jurists, where no one and no political institution monopolized or could monopolize the production of the law. The historical story is long and complicated, and I have discussed it elsewhere. The importance of this phenomenon, though, cannot be overestimated, for it goes not only to law, but also importantly to the way Muslims govern themselves politically and constitutionally. Nomo-locality prevented the concentration of legal powers in the hands of a single entity, which explains why no sultan or caliph could impose his will, or his legal will on the population. His legal will, that's the law is very important in the body politic. Not even under the gunpowder empires, which were more kind of aggressive regulators. No ruler in the entire history of Islam until the very end of the 18th century enjoyed legal sovereignty. Even the jurists themselves could not change the law. Even the jurists themselves could not change the law wholesale, play with it in any significant way, except as on a piecemeal fashion, case by case. They will deal with 1, 2, 3, 5 cases. Maybe the biggest jurist would be changing the law in 5 single cases. Wouldn't make any difference anywhere for political structures and governmentality. The other feature of the Sharia is its strong predilection to socio-synthesization. The Sharia was attuned to the fact that people live in communities and that these communities had an ecology. The communities were conceived to have an ecology. If you take one element in the ecology, the whole system collapses, and they understood this. Dealing with a member of the community meant dealing with that community as a totality. People were seen as unequal. Some are rich, some poor, some privileged, some dispossessed, some are physically weak, some strong, some are held more responsible to society, some are less, some are more intelligent, talented, skilled, or educated than others. These are, we see them every day. The dominant average Muslim view in political and sociological thought was that God created people unequal so that they would need each other. This is everywhere in the political and the juridical thinking of Muslim, the big Muslim jurists and intellectuals. This is an oft-repeated understanding. So they are born unequal in order to need each other, in order to cooperate, in order to make them what they are. مجتمع the Khaldunian term not عصبية حيوان اجتماعي حيوان اجتماعي, and that's what distinguishes humans from others for them. And then many things follow from this, including rationality and so forth and so on. There was no blindfolded lady of justice in Islam. This is important. People are not born equal, and it is even ridiculous to think so. The idea that people are unequal by nature would be unthinkable in the modern legal establishment, especially in liberal democracies. I suspect that imposing on this establishment the presupposition that people are inherently unequal would wreak havoc with the entire system, an imposition that would require a re-evaluation of the system from the grounds up. I would say it would require a legal and political revolution. But interestingly enough, this idea was foundational in the Sharia, and it was made to work successfully. To acknowledge the inequality of people is to acknowledge that those who are weak need the support and giving of the more endowed, not to mention the support of the social and legal institutions of Islamic polity. This translated to a formula that the law must work to offset social and economic inequality. This was evidenced in the charitable projects that the Sharia constructed along the way, along a long history, from the religious taxes, zakah, etc., and various forms of institutionalized donations, to the dominating phenomenon of waqf, which constituted some 60% of real property in the lands of Islam, from Morocco to India. The waqf was the most prominent feature of Islamic civilization, materially, socially, educationally, etc. What I'm arguing here is that seeing people as unequal does not necessarily and always amount to discriminating against them. In fact, this distinction is an essential ethical requirement. In some contexts, double standards are not only desirable, they are an ontological necessity and even a legal moral requirement. I always say, until today, the US government owes me something like $40,000, and I find that it's not worth fighting for it, because I'm not going to win. I probably will hire a lawyer, pay him $40,000 or her to get me the money, and then would still fail, because they'll say, okay, sorry, we can't give it to you, which they told me already. So imagine. So that's why I always invoke the individual vis-a-vis Microsoft, who can fight these giants. In a system that enshrines effective ethical and legal boundaries as strong measures of protection and care, adopting the philosophy of the inequality of the subject is good. For it is only through this kind of philosophy that a system of genuine social responsibility can be installed. Equality before the law is a fiction that was necessary for Europe to adopt in order for it to complete the separation between fact and value, between the ethical and everything else. The ethics of church and monarch did not work well for Europe, resulting in abuse and trauma. And so another way needed to be invented, so-called popular sovereignty, equality, and fraternity. You know, the French slogans, fraternité, égalité, etc. Yet, treating people as equal meant and continues to mean mass governance, just as we nowadays have mass production of capitalist goods. In fact, at one level of analysis, the two are not very different from each other. For this is the modern way of control and exploitation. You can see it in economics, in law, and in politics, everywhere else. In continental Europe, the most monumental developments were the post-15th century rise of the state and unprecedented forms of capitalism and material ambition. These capitalism and the supposedly popular forms of governance, continue to be the two legs on which the liberal democratic order stands. But this system needs many props to make it work, many other props to make it work. Among others, it needs bureaucracy, a novel notion in human history that presupposes several things: political, ethical, and social, which were the specific results of Europe's experience and its violent and unhappy existence. And now we all take them for granted. We adopted them as if they were our history. Bureaucracy's internal logic is the assumption that all people are equal before the law, that all must be subject to the same standard forms of rational administration. But we must also recognize that in bureaucracy, there is the problem of the evacuation of moral agency. It's a long story that one can read Hannah Arendt and even the Eichmann in Jerusalem to understand how bureaucracy actually literally eviscerates the ethical impulse of the individual in modernity. The bureaucrat operates under the rule of a chain of command, the same chain that exists in the corporation and modern armies all over the world. The underlying assumption here in all of these interconnected and unitary phenomena is the painful fact that individual ethical judgment, individual ethical agency can no longer be trusted and therefore has no role to play in management and governance. Trust in moral accountability has vanished. The evacuation of ethical agency is tantamount to a deep distrust of humans as creatures who are intrinsically incapable of being good. And this is because modernity has built a system that assumes the ethical bankruptcy of the human subject, of the individual human subject. It is assumed, it's taken for granted. We assume it and then we begin to do things. And so what Europe and modernity have done was to construct a system almost entirely based on this assumption of human nature. Look, for instance, at the philosophy of human nature that underlies and frames one of modernity's most cherished concepts and institutions, namely the conception and practice of the much coveted and desired separation of powers and the rule of law. The system of separation rests on the dark assumption that in society, passion combats passion, greed countervails greed, ambition offsets ambition. It is not a race of who is more ethical, as the Quran, for example, keeps challenging us, who is لِنَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. It is about balancing evil with evil, the assumption being that two evils produce one good. I have yet to wrap my mind around it. I don't understand it, I must tell you. I can go on and on to delineate the differences in the two systems insofar as the issue of treating people as equals is concerned. But my fundamental point is this, that to understand the other, especially the other in history, one must renounce eccentric notions, beginning an inquiry of the other by questioning oneself first. But this is easier said than done. And here we face a tough question. What does it take to move Orientalism to Post-Orientalism? What would be our sources to accomplish this task? First, I believe that no solutions to this problem or any other can come from within our episteme, from our epistemic system, the forms of knowledge that we are adopting. Our system, now global and Orientalist, even within the so-called Orient itself, and this is important to score, has been incapable of offering any structural and real solutions. Our system is therapeutic, if I may lean on Philip Reif in his famous book, The Triumph of Therapy, The Triumph of the Therapeutic. But I extend the meaning of therapy to all the dimensions of modern life, where we are dealing with capitalism, psychology, law, politics, or the all-important climate and environment. In simple terms, our solutions represent what might be called bandage solutions. There is no doubt that if we continue to adopt our current forms of knowledge, we will necessarily continue to resort to therapy as a modality of cure. Real solutions must therefore come from the outside. I gave an example in the class of Dr. Lumbard about antacids today, how modernity solves the problem of anti-acidity, of acids in the stomach, which is actually very illustrative, but I'm not going to take your time now. I hope we recorded that part. Real solutions, real solutions must therefore come from the outside, that is, from outside the hegemonic modern and its governing structures. And so the only outside of our present is our history. For obviously we know nothing, as I said yesterday, of our future. I want to venture the claim that our future rests on the question, of what will we do with our past? What will we make of it? And the first question to be asked is, where did we go wrong in doing with our history what we have done so far? Which I would characterize as epistemologically criminal act. My argument is that things began to go wrong in Europe, where the ethical represented in European Christianity was abused and made to serve unethical ends. Yet this is not the story of the rest of the world. And we must resist the urge to see non-European history with the same lens as Europe saw its own history, which is what unfortunately happened and continues to happen on a daily basis, and the situation actually is getting worse. Considering the limited time I have today, I have spoken enough about the problems we are encountering all over the globe. Let me now speak of some proposed solutions which I know are profound and not so easy to implement. But we have to face the problems heads on. I think that our first major challenge is to alter our relationship to nature. And by nature, I mean a complex of things. All of us, generally speaking, have been profoundly colored by the European conception of nature, a conception that has adopted a sovereign attitude of instrumentalism and, to be frank, epistemic arrogance of the worst sort. The essential problem here is that we have severed the conception of nature from intrinsic value and dissociated it from a meaningful cosmological outlook. This deterioration of our conception of nature has a clear genealogy that stemmed from Europe's attempt to liberate itself from the tyranny of the Catholic Church and from the modes of political tyranny, the absolutists and monarchs, etc. These were the two constitutive forces that cannot be separated or are not to be separated from each other. In this process of liberation, the link between cosmology and its ethical effects were severed from the world as matter, setting the stage to the rise of deism and a view of the world in which God or any higher ethical power was eviscerated, if not annihilated altogether. Man ends up the ruler of men. Man ends up to be the ruler of men, and holding, for that matter, a skewed conception of nature. From this point on, nature was to be defined whimsically and arbitrarily, where the human and the animal were conceived in new, commodified, racialized, and instrumentalized terms. The full man now is the Western man, and all else are graded in value against this, the measure of this superior and supreme man, Hegelian in spirit and Darwinist in evolution. Just as the supreme man became the emerging and secularized ruling elite of Europe, Europe, in its political power, elite and even rabble, became the sovereigns of the world, deciding the fate of almost all people in the Americas as well as Africa and Asia. As I have elaborated in great detail in Restating Orientalism, the middle book, I believe, this process of colonization was the result of an epistemic sovereignty that changed forever forms of knowledge in the non-West. And it is precisely this epistemic sovereignty that has led to the wholesale destruction of our planet and ourselves as societies and individuals. The solution to this colossal phenomenon is a qualitative reduction of this epistemology, of this epistemic arrogance. This kind of reduction goes by another name, namely epistemic humility. Epistemic humility requires a reimagining of what we are as human material. If it is true, and I think it is true, that we are what we do, and what we do is an expression of what we think, then our thinking or rationality must be overhauled, because we have not been doing very well. Yet rationality and reason are not just ways of reasoning about the world that can be abstracted from our lives as they are practically lived. How we experience things in the world determines how we think about them. Let me give you an example, one that is most essential to human life. If we tend to think that all we need is to have money to buy food, that food is to be taken for granted as long as one can afford it, then we are doomed to abstracting the quality of food as a commodity, one that can be sold and purchased upon the availability of money. Little else factors into our thinking and reasoning about food, which is probably the most important thing we have. Without it, we just all vanish. How much is the studies and really scholarship is about food is very little, and it's very interesting. I think the food industry is making sure that we don't study food because we don't want people to think about what food is doing to them. But if we think about food at a higher level of existence, say at an ontological level, then our attitude of food or to food and consequently to everything else does not only change but also gives food another meaning altogether, one that is neither commodified nor instrumentalized. Food becomes tied to our existence as a bounty, as a gift that we cannot take for granted. It becomes an ontological, even a cosmological issue. To give you a parable that illustrates my meaning, consider the following Sufi depiction in a little cute Sufi story. A Sufi depiction of a moment in the story of creation, a moment that is as significant as the story of Adam and Eve eating at the apple or the congregation of the angels with God upon the creation of Adam. It's a very important story. The parable goes as follows. When God created the self and nafs, which is the locus of struggle between good and evil, always in our self, he asked the self and nafs, who is your Lord? Thereupon the self replied to God rather arrogantly, and who's your Lord? So of course God got very upset. We have to grant that much. It's very upsetting to hear this. And so he sent the self to the sea of hunger, Bahr al-Ju', for 4,000 years. Interesting choice. He didn't send it to the fire of hell. He sent it to the sea of hunger, out of all forms of punishment. After the period had lapsed, God returned to the self and asked it once more, who is your Lord? And the self said, you are my Lord, Anta Rabbi. The idea here is that through hunger, the self understood the connection between food and belief, between taqwa and the source of blessings that nourishes existence. Hunger convinced the self to go the way of belief, which is also the way to reduce arrogance and sovereign knowledge. The very subjection of the self to hunger was not just a physical act of trial, but rather an epistemological act of first order. And when I say epistemological, I don't mean here that epistemology can be in any way be divorced from ethics. That's a modern distinction, very phony. When you thought of epistemology in Islam, you thought of ethics as well. You thought of ontology at the same time. There was no separation between these domains. Now, epistemology is one thing, ethics is another, ontology is another. My other point I'm trying to make is the connection between seemingly physical experience and moral knowledge, where sustenance is tied intrinsically and structurally to knowledge of the world. This is why fasting and even practice of hunger, ju', not just sawm, but ju', seem to be non-variables in nearly all pre-modern cultures of the world, at least the major ones. The Buddhist, Hindu, Confucian, Jewish, Judaic, Islamic, Greek, Roman, and many others. It's found in almost in every religion or religion. Epistemic humility is a complicated thing because practicing and implementing it is none easier than conceiving it. But fortunately, we have good teachers. We have a long list of peoples who made this humility a cornerstone of their lives. It's not just theory, it happened in history. Of course, the Greeks and the Romans excelled at it, but they also had good teachers, fantastic teachers, who perfected these techniques in the lands of the Nile and Western Asia, from the Levant to the Euphrates and beyond. And Muslims were the heirs to the net value of this historical legacy. They just reaped the benefits of all of these together, put together. Epistemic humility, however, is a specific thing. It can have no existence without foregrounding, without a larger context. Epistemic humility sits at the heart of a humility in general. And humility in general must be buffered by a host of other qualities, by a sense of appreciation and gratitude to all that counts as creation. And these are, when I say appreciation and gratitude, these are actually sophisticated, complicated, complex technologies of the self. They are not just mere words. Ontological respect and ontological gratitude are therefore, and among other attributes, dialectically woven into the fabric of humility. Humility, as many great Muslim scholars argued, bars transgression. Humility is the perfect happy middle between arrogance and self-deprecation, between a sense of self-importance and self-abnegation. But this happy middle is the result of extensive and intensive work that cares for the self. Caring for the self, almost absent in modernity, caring for the self is a wide-ranging program of praxis, where mind and body are equal partners and mutually supporting. Here, Descartes would just be totally irrelevant. To care for the self is to train it, to start deliberately and self-consciously from inside out, from inside yourself before you start with or approach others. Pierre Hadot and Michel Foucault effectively spent their intellectual lives articulating what is perhaps the most important strand of philosophy in the 20th century. This is why I like their work. It has many problems, but there is an aspect of their work that is extremely crucial for people who want to study the history of Islam. And that is the direct answer, ethically speaking, direct answer to the question, who are we now in this age? And to answer this question, they both found it essential. By the way, Hadot came before Foucault. Foucault was actually using Hadot to great benefit. And to answer this question, they both found it essential to speak of what Hadot called the inner citadel, the political capital of the soul, that which leads to the proper conception of and ethical praxis in the world. Anything from fasting and prayer to studying and writing and regimes of sleep and even silence are all techniques of the self, technologies of the self. They are all productive mechanisms that set in motion a particular attitude to the world. If you are the kind of person who will wake up between, for example, 4 and 7 to do reading, just to study something important to you, every day, that is going to change your character. That's going to create, this is what it means to have a technology of the self. These techniques are always structurally interrelated and are codependent. For one produces the other, props it, and stands in a dialectical relationship with it. Epistemic humility is merely one of the results of the technologies of the self. We will miss much if we do not realize that most essential feature of these techniques is the intention of the self to operate on the self. It has to be an autonomous project. You do it to yourself. And this is, of course, will not be fully understood without, for example, saying the modern subject is not operating on the self really at all nowadays, is waiting for all sorts of other agencies, especially capitalism and the state, to operate on him and her. So that's why we are the product of consumerism more than we are the product of our deliberate in reflection and operation on our own selves as ethical beings. The techniques are never driven into the self from the outside. And that's very important. You don't let anybody mess with your inner ethical constitution. It's your sacred trust. You do it yourself. You know who you are. This is the strength, the inner strength, the inner citadel that Ado is talking about. No, look at today, the new generation I'm sorry to say this, but the new generation is quite fragile emotionally. People who lived at the same age 40 years ago, when I was flourishing, I think we were much tougher. And this is precisely because of this. Instead of investing in therapy, I think it is easier and cheaper to recover this. It's for free. And it does much better job. It's like instead of drinking water, just clean water, you go drink Pepsi as a way of quenching yourself. I think that's a very poor rational choice. So the techniques are never driven into the self from the outside, as if to allow ourselves to be guided by external agencies, as in the way consumerism and capitalism are defining our identities today. We are nowadays largely the creatures of our political and economic technologies, as we stand thoroughly accused of being state objects and slaves of the capitalistic machine. In this overwhelming context, the operation of the self on the self is a subversive act of liberation, where we embark on a transition from so-called negative forms of liberty to positive modes of freedom. This positive freedom has been the dominant mode of existence in human history, a mode that for pathological reasons, and I'm not hesitant to name it for what it is, pathological reasons, has become faded in the modern condition, as Foucault brilliantly pointed out. In this very same dictionary, history of the present, the only organizing historical principle we know is the history of these technologies. Nothing else in history matters. See how my concept of history now is totally different from anything that exists so far in our schools and universities. We are what we think, and what we think is not a spontaneous development, but one that is deliberately structured, either by us or by someone else for us. We are our technologies. As much as we say we are what we eat, we are our technologies. To do scholarship today is to decolonize our thinking, is not a mere act of cerebral or rational interrogation, or of an internalized engagement of the intellect. The intellect without the soul is nothing but a dangerous machine, one that can and often does lead to genocides and all forms of destruction, be it of other humans, other societies, or of nature and the environment. To decolonize scholarship will remain a shallow act of pontification without training the self first. We, each of us, must learn and embody and absorb what it really means to live, not just to understand what epistemic humility means. Finally, and to conclude my lecture, it is necessary to connect epistemic humility with historical writing. We are talking about history after all. How does this humility affect a major and structural change in our conception of the historical other? Of course, a full answer to this important question is complex and time-consuming, but let me briefly gesture toward it. To have humility is a philological act of empathy. To have humility is a philological act of empathy. To be empathetic is to be an excellent philologist who aims to understand the other in order to learn from that other that which helps him or her in ethical self-formation. In other words, true philology is itself a technology of the self. Otherwise, philology becomes what we have today. It's a way of colonizing the other. And of course, some people say, that's the one I want. Well, صحتين. If that's what they want, that's fine. But my concept of philology is the one that takes philology to be a technology of the self. How is it so? Empathetic philology, as a genuine expression of epistemic humility, means that it will transcend the problem of translatability. The problem of translatability has been the problem of not only Orientalism, but also of all modern studies of Islamic and other histories. Now, even by Muslims and other Asians and Africans. I should have said in the beginning that Orientalists are not just some bunch of white people. Orientalism is thriving actually now more in the Muslim world than in the West. And that's the irony. That's why I kept the lecture as it is. I gave it in the West before in a shorter and less developed form. And I developed the same themes for this one, and I didn't change the audience, because the audience is the same. Orientalism in Paris is as much as it is in, let's say, in Cairo generally. I'm not going to specify where in Cairo. I have many Egyptian friends, I don't want to offend them. It is a modern problem that is insensitive to the traditional historical text. To study a text is to study not only its general narrative and language, and then turn around to generalize from such an impressionistic reading of it. Rather, it is to be sensitive to the vernacular of the users of the original language, to read the text the way they meant it, word by word. Epistemic humility and empathetic philology require the placing of oneself as much as possible in the shoes of these language users. This placement being a technological process and surely anything but a simple or simplistic act. For example, and this is only one example, we take the word adl, very famous word, right? We take the word adl to mean justice, and then we go on to analyze the sources, the Islamic sources, according to our understanding of what justice in our conception and meaning of justice means. This is a grave mistake, an atrocious mistake. But through analysis of adl, but thorough analysis of adl will show that the bar of fair and equitable treatment in Islam is much higher. For in Arabic, it means swerving from the tradition-bound path. It's very easy to be unjust in the Islamic tradition. So they don't mean the same thing. It is very easy to be unjust in the Islamic tradition. We therefore cannot interpret it always to mean what we in the here and now mean by it. We cannot then write any political history of Islam without this empathetic philology. And I just mentioned one word. Imagine if you were to write the political history of Islam and miss about 100 of these terms, which is easy to have. At least you are working with 100 central terms if you write an article or a book. Imagine if you get them the same inaccuracies the way we conceive adl translated to modern conception. The whole history will be wrong. And that's precisely what Orientalism did. And so epistemic humility does not only amount to a superior form of research and understanding, but also requires the overhauling of our present understanding of Islam's political history. Once we do this, we would have overcome the problems of translatability, of universalization, and of distortion, if not superiority and racism in scholarship. And it is only when we overcome these problems through a refashioning of our ethical subjectivities that we can say that we have decolonized knowledge, of course for ourselves, but as well as for the other. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hallaq. And I've been able to ask Dr. Hallaq many questions over the last 2 days, so I will not abuse my prerogative as moderator, and I will open the floor up to questions from the audience. Yes, so first this gentleman here, you were the first one to have your hand up.
طيب السلام عليكم. أولا شكرا على هذه المحاضرة. طيب أنا عندي تعليقات كثيرة منها من قصور الاستشراق ومن الكلام هذا. عندي إشكال أساسي في الطرح كامل، أن دكتور أنت قاعد تتكلم معنا وكأن كلنا مستشرقين، تتكلم معنا وكأن كلنا في داخل الحقل. وإشكالي فيه بقول لك، لأن أنت كل طرحك قائم على من يدرس وما هو موضوع الدرس، واللي تبي تسوي إنه بدل ما أن إحنا نكون فقط موضوع، نكون إحنا الآخر اللي ممكن يصير فيه حوار معه. هذه الحركة من قصور الاستشراق ومن المحاضرة الحين. إشكالي في هذا أن في شيء في المواقع والمقامات اللي إحنا نتحرك من خلالها هي مختلفة تماما. في فرق بين، خلنا نعمم أن إحنا كلنا مستشرقين، ونقول أن في فرق بين المستشرق اللي قاعد في كولومبيا ويدرس الإسلام والحياة العامة والحداثة، وبين المستشرق اللي قاعد في دول الجنوب العالمي المسلم. في فرق كبير بين الاثنين، ومساحتهم للحوار مختلفة تماما. فأنا عندي إشكال بالكامل مع هذه التصفيرة. هاي الأولى، النقطة الأولى. النقطة الثانية، في مقولة تتردد عندك تتعلق بالبنية العميقة للإيكولوجيات في المنطقة، وأنت تبني من خلالها أن فيها أصلا بمعنى وكأنها نظام اجتماعي ما مسبق، وما قد شفتك تبنيه في مكان معين بشكل واضح. أنا ما يعني في الشريعة مو موجود، في الدولة المستحيلة مش موجود، في قصور الاستشراق مش موجود، في reforming modernity مش موجود. The deep structures of the ecologies. The deep structures of the ecologies. إيه أنت تأخذها من قتاري، بس أبيك تبنيها لي، يعني أحاول إني أستوعبها، خاصة إنك تبني عليها كل مداخلة اللامساواة. Which is I'm fine with. إذا بناخذ مداخلة نيتشه على الآخر I'm fine with، بس خلنا نقنع الناس فيها.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by deep structures, unless you think my scholarship is not deep enough. This is your taste, and I will give you that right. But deep structure, when you spend 20 years studying, for example, the inner dynamics of the Sharia, anthropologically, intellectually, theoretically, philosophically, I don't know what you want more deeper than this. Well, let me answer. This is the best answer I can give to this question, really. But in terms of generalizing about Orientalists, well, of course, you are right. The umbrella under which Orientalists operate is very large, and like the umbrella itself, which is like this. Some Orientalists are much more kind of more deeply entrenched in racial and colonialist inflictions, and some others less. Some are actually Orientalists who are excellent. I gave in Restating Orientalism, I dedicated one full chapter to René Guénon as the Orientalist who was not an Orientalist. He, in fact, did a better job at dealing with Orientalism that Said could ever even dream of. This is why I enlist him. So yes, there are varieties of it, but generally, I'm not looking at, you see, that's the thing. Depth is only one important aspect in scholarship. The other aspect is to be able to see the forest for the trees. And that's where most people get lost. They don't understand what is important, what's not. I love certain Muslim thinkers because I see them literally sharks of distinguishing between the forest and the trees. They go for the jugular vein. They know where it is. They don't get lost anywhere. And that is very important to do. I'm talking about the kind of the paradigmatic structure of what it means to study our history, either in the Muslim world or in the Western world. These are the two main units. I'm not looking at China and Japan, how they are studied. They don't have much, very little. And if you look at this, you realize that in the Muslim world today, on the whole, as an average, as a general bulk weight in the production of scholarship, they are largely imitating the same pattern of philological and historical work that Orientalism has laid for them before. Because to be honest with you, if you know the history of Orientalism very well, you know that it started around the middle of the 19th century in Europe, based on earlier kind of problematic theological Catholic elaborations that became secularized like everything else in Europe, right? And then it continues to work within a very aggressive and vibrant colonialist enterprise. Colonialism and Orientalism worked not only hand in hand. It's not like two separate people held hand together and walked. They were part of the same organ. They are literally two wheels spinning within the same machine. And so that is the only kind of knowledge that we know about Islam. Muslims never wrote their own history in the modern sense of the term of history. Tabari is not a historian that is working in the same way as a typical historian in a university. Forget about this. That's a different kind of conception of history. Tarikh or ta'rikh in Islam until the 19th century is a totally different kind of historiography than what we have today in the West. Our knowledge of history, our Orientalism, our everything has been laid down in fundamentals and in structure by the European project. And we are repeating it about ourselves. That is what I mean by this. So we are Orientalists. Not every one of us, but we as a whole contingency in the Muslim world, we are as a culture generally extending from end to end. The Islamic scholarship on Islam is replicating Orientalist narrative.
Yes.
Hello. Thank you so much, Professor Hallaq, for thought-provoking talk. Well, if I divide your lecture and come to solution you propose, putting emphasis on ethics, I found it extremely wonderful and insightful. And myself, as a president of the International Sociological Association, my agenda was how to connect moral philosophy to social science. So really, I found that this is amazing. However, the first part of your talk, I mean, if I remove the word West and Europe and I put Arab world, I can diagnose the same problem. How the notion of justice, about the inequality, should I attribute all these problems, the gap between the action and the thought in the same way? So should I argue that Muslim world have all this problem because of the theory operating there, which is related to Islam in some part?
You mean in the West?
No. I'm talking about. I mean, you, if you like, I understand your the first part to say to curse the Western modernity because talking about how they apply liberal democracy or political liberalism. If I do the same thing for the Muslim world, I should curse the Islam as you curse til'an, as you curse the liberal democracy. I mean, simply, I grew up in Syria, okay? So I don't see today any solution to Syria except democracy. And I don't see any solution today to the Arab world operating outside of the liberal political project, including not rationality. I mean the way you describe the Western modernity by taking a kind of extreme cases. I mean, Jean Rawls talk about reasonable accommodation. Inside of reasonable accommodation, it's a moral reasoning where we can incorporate religion, we can incorporate mythology, our tradition, etc. So I think, and I will stop here, I think what worry me and I am really, I read all what you wrote. I enjoy reading them. That you forge them and us, and this is very harmful. I mean, 90% of our problem of knowledge production is not we are imitating the Orientalist knowledge. It's about the self-censorship because we live in authoritarian countries. So this is, I did a self.
I got you.
So us and them, and look how people read your work from, and I hope you are aware.
Can we let him respond? We do have other people want to ask questions.
Yeah,
no, I got you. I do feel you for your pain. It comes from deep inside. I'm not denying your agonies, but I think a proper, deep understanding. Speaking of depth, I would like to see what the depth of others are. If you understand deeply what liberalism is and what are the entanglements of liberalism in all sorts of other domains within the what we call the modern project, you will understand that liberal democracy as well as capitalism, which work together in very organic forms, as well as other domains, they are all working together to produce what we have. I don't care what John Rawls says if what we are doing generally about everything related to political and economic concepts are leading us to the verge of destruction in terms of the environment. This is the product of liberalism. This is the product of what we call freedom. This is the product which is essential for capitalism. There is no capitalism without freedom. You are asking me to adopt an idealistic style of freedom that is isolated from the real forces that operate in the modern project, which is really capitalism and the vicious forces of the paradigmatic state. And I'm talking about the empire, Russia, the United States. These are the movers of the, and they are connected intricately with the economic, with money, really. This is what it means, freedom. This is not about elections. Elections mean nothing in the modern world. If you understand them correctly, they are the cover-up for the liberal democracies to convince the really less than intelligent average citizen that they are voicing their own will, popular will. That's why I said in the lecture, you should always bracket popular will. Popular will is a very complicated subject. So my advice to you is to really deepen your understanding of what liberalism is in all of its manifestations. There is we can begin with, if you want, the first book on the list of reading, and the rest you can find yourself. It's called Ugly Freedoms, just appearing about a year ago, even less. Begin with that book. That is a book that will unpack so many of the problems related to our concepts of freedom. Freedom, everybody is preaching freedom. It's our theology today, and it is destroying us. How people read me is not my problem. They can read me as they wish. That's their right. But I have to say what I have to say, and when I see something that I can stake my reputation on, I will say it, and I don't care. So I cannot just change my tune of music so people will not read me in that way. Too bad.
Dr. Hasna?
تفضل.
My comment and question would be this. While listening to you, I think he used a lot of the word of the inequality as a way of really presenting the case.
Inequality?
Yeah. And my question is whether this is the best description, or we need to find a different word like similar or the same or the situation to represent what we are trying to allude to. Because to me, when you look at, the weak, the sick, the wealthy,
sure,
the poor, those constitute a status rather than something level of quality, if you would like, from humanity point of view. And I don't know if this is something that you could really elaborate a little bit.
So you're suggesting that I use which word instead of inequality?
I'm trying to work with you on finding something more appropriate, because I think what you described, it's like more of a status, more of a talent, different talents of people that lead into us needing each other.
Yeah.
See what I mean?
Yeah, I see perfectly. Maybe you are right. The word inequality is not the most apt word, but I thought it's kind of, I'm crossing my message, roughly speaking. The idea is that people are not you're right, are not of the same. But some of it is unequal, but some of it is something else, which you are right about. But the point is that they are so different. Some are physically strong and some are physically weak. They need each other.
Yeah, they're still different.
They're still different. So in that sense, yeah. Forgive the lexical misusage.
I was just trying to really highlight.
No, absolutely. I totally agree. I will take that one for sure.
Up in the back.
السلام عليكم. خالد المناعي، أدرس التمويل الإسلامي في جامعة حمد الخليفة. في البداية شاكر لك دكتور وائل على حضورك الكريم، واسمح لي أرحب فيك بكوني أحد طلبة الجامعة. سؤالي دكتور وائل هو أكثر عن رأيك الشخصي في تأثير دراسة الاستشراق والفكر الغربي وتداخلاته على عالمنا العربي، سواء على صعيد الإعلام أو المواد الدراسية أو حتى عن طريق أفلام الكرتون. ألن تؤثر هذه الدراسة على قيمنا العربية وأصولنا فيها؟ ما رأيك؟
شكرا. As I have been saying, the effect of Orientalism is more than what we think that Edward Said wrote about it as a malevolent effect in terms of conspiring or cooperating with colonialism and whatnot. But the real effect of Orientalism is not only in the military and colonizing forces of Europe. It is in fact in changing the subjectivity of Muslims themselves. Let me give you an example. To me, it is much more insidious and dangerous for example, for a group of Egyptian or Syrian students in the 19th century already to go study in Paris. You know, there was, for example, let me tell you a concrete major issue that happened in the colonization of Algeria by the French. Algeria wanted to dismantle the entire system of waqfs in Algeria. They needed the land to plant grapes so they can have more French wine. Basically, that's what so much of it was. And so they want the land to be freed from the waqf. And so they sent an army of Orientalists arguing that waqf is not part of the true Islam. This is French Orientalists telling Muslims that you don't know your own history. We are telling you that the waqf was not part of the true Islamic religion. Beautiful, right? And so a whole discourse develops, swings over to the British Orientalists, and then a little bit to the German Orientalists, and then you have a whole Orientalist world producing knowledge about the problematics of Islamic history because they use the waqf to militate against the divisions of the shares of the Quran, of inherent mirath in the Quran. So not only that they added something that is superfluous and should not have been added, but actually they were bad Muslims because they actually played around with the Quran. They are trying to subvert the Quran. So it turns out that the French Orientalists are more of Muslim believers than the Muslims themselves. Another beautiful, right? Now, so far, this project is about colonizing the Algerian land. It didn't work very well until later in the, and then of course everything collapses. And then, having achieved this colonialist project, the professors who propounded this doctrine in French scholarship became the noble and esteemed mentors of Muslim students going from Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt to study with them. And so you get a generation of Muslim and Middle Eastern people, including some Christians, like, for example, the famous Maronite Lebanese scholar Emile Tien. Emile Tayyan, of course, Tayyan means the plasterer. He becomes Emile Tien. Beautiful, elegant French name. Emile Tien writes several volumes, becoming more Catholic than the Pope himself. He is not just an Orientalist. Actually, he's a vicious Orientalist. That is what I worry about. And in cinema, I can give you other examples, a long story, but that's the point.
Thank you very much. And this young lady in the back.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for your very thought-provoking lecture. I think this question was asked earlier, but I just also wanted to say that you said that human beings are created inherently unequal, that God created human beings unequal so that they would need each other. But I think that's even problematic, not just for a liberal Western audience, but also for, you know, from the Islamic epistemology, where God says we created you from nafs and wahida, and one ruh, one breath, and one nafs. But my other question is about your book, The Impossible State. I realize it came out almost 10 years ago now, and I really loved your conclusion or like suggestion that you made in it, talking about how we should establish moral-based communities where the central domain is one of the moral, regardless of whether the people who comprise it are Muslims or not. So I'm wondering, 10 years later, what are your thoughts on that? And because you seemed pretty optimistic at the time with the Arab Spring was kind of, you know, going on. So what are your thoughts on it now? Thank you.
About the way out, you mean?
About just the idea of the moral-based communities as a solution to the incompatibility between the Islamic State.
I don't think I have changed my mind about this. There is no way around it, in my opinion. Even if we operate not on the high political level, on the simple social level, the restoration of a cogent, structured, well-ordered family unit at one size or another, preferably the bigger the better, is perhaps one of the best problems, solutions for our... We are, by the way, embarking on a major disaster that is recent in our modern trajectory that we are not addressing sufficiently. Mental health. I used to talk with the same verve and nerve and about the environment, and now, of course, that's when I was teaching like 30, 40 years ago. And the students loved it, and so I knew this is important because it resonated with them. Now, of course, it's an old story. Everybody knows it. But you know what is attracting the attention of everybody now? When you begin to talk about mental disease, the statistics about mental disease in universities, not to mention in other parts of the world, are so devastating that we need to begin to address them very soon. It's as bad, in fact, it is worse than the destruction of the environment, because you can destroy your truck and with a good mind and so you can rebuild it. But if you are crazy and your truck is broken, forget it. And so mental disease is not done. The beauty about the author I mentioned here, Philip Roth, called The Triumph of the Therapeutic, is to show that we do not address problems from the source, really, to solve real problems. We just give bandage solutions to them. So we talk about therapy. New York, I live in New York. New York is the city of therapists. Every single New Yorker, it seems to me, has 2 therapists. We need to solve this problem in the moral community, the integral community that constitutes itself according to sound ethical values that allows for the individual to flourish within established rules. Every child knows that they are supported. They are not flying in the air like a lost ship in the sea. That is what they need, and that is so. I haven't changed my mind about this. As for again the individuals were broke. Yes, I agree. The Qur'anic verse is correct, but it has absolutely nothing to do with what I mean. But if you want to get a good sense of what I mean, really from the sources, from Islamic sources, why don't you read Adab al-Dunya wa Deen of Mawardi? He talks about it plenty, and in ways that no other probably intellectual has done like him. He takes his time, and his articulation is Pretty good. Yes, I'm not sure now. I haven't seen it.
Well, this young lady has the microphone already.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we go to that,
And
to
then
the
we'll
West
go over
Bank.
this side, yeah. So we go back and forth.
Yes.
I'm probably like regurgitating Orientalist tropes right now, but a lot of the leading voices that I've heard have mentioned that like it was only between the 8th and the 11th century that the Islamic or the Muslim world really flourished. And then after the 11th century, a merging happened between the ulama and the state, and that this merging was like the cause behind the delay. And these are like recent works that are coming up. And then other voices point to like institutional reasons, like you were mentioning awqaf, and that you can't inherit awqaf, and that caused the delay. So I'm wondering, I mean, if you were to advise future students, like graduate students, to undertake studies to really understand these notions, do we need to kind of question our language in the sense, like, one of my questions had always been like, why is there such a gap between the Western world and the Muslim world? Or is it more so like...
Gap in what sense?
I guess economic gap, that economic delay after the 18th century.
Oh.
And then, or should I be questioning the historiography methods, the way that we engage with history?
Yeah. Well, yeah, a very good question. Very complicated one too. I would say both. The first, in terms of depicting the 19th century in particular by modern scholarship, is plagued by ideological inflections that are quite dangerous, and I understand where they come from, but they are not helpful to reconstructing the history of modern Islam, because of the fact that so many of these people who are working on this field are happen to be from the Muslim world writing in the West. And their purpose is to find justification for making Islam adapt to any reality, really. There are many people who are trying to square the triangle, make Islam fit into the liberal mold. Well, I'm not sure why first if it's possible, and why do we need to do this? This is so an act of contortion that will never succeed. And when I say that Islam cannot fit in the liberal mode, I don't mean that Islam is not good enough to fit in the liberal mode. I mean that Islam has its own identity and power and energy and its tools and vibrancy, that it can stand on its own. It has an independent voice. It has its own set of values. It has its own way of dealing and seeing the world. And so if you were to want to say, oh, well, you know what, we cannot really revive that old Islam, so at least let's change Islam in such a way as to make it fit and call it Islam. But this is what Shakht actually advised Muslims. You know what Shakht did, the father of Islamic law? What he did was to write the history of the first century of the Hijrah, saying, absolutely, it has nothing to do with Islam. Islamic law arose, the Sharia arose in the first century by thieving Roman law, Jewish law, and other laws, and giving a veneer, that's his word, a veneer that is Islamic. So everything is not Islamic, but there is a veneer Islamic, and Muslims managed to convince themselves to live with it until the 20th century. And now they need to reform their law again, so why don't they just borrow from the West again? And he said that clearly in a 1970 article, I believe 79, I'm not sure, and give it another Islamic veneer, and that's it. That's exactly what these Muslims are doing. They are following closely Shakht's advice. That is a bankrupt kind of scholarship. If it roams around, you know, scholarship is highly problematic, by the way. I mean, you could have a whole production of hundreds and hundreds of books on the same theme, and then 20 years later, there is revision. They believe in it as the ultimate truth when it is there, and nobody can question it. And then 20 years later, it becomes susceptible to revision, and then it becomes old scholarship. There is no truth about anything anyway, especially when ideology is so that is one thing. In terms of the second part of your question, I think we should begin to reject, at least begin, if not totally reject, the paradigm of decline that was. There's always the idea that what went wrong with Islam for the West to dominate. We don't ask actually what happened in the West. We ask about what is the problem with Chinese, by the way, do the same thing. Chinese scholars have done this equally, like Muslims. They say, oh, what went wrong with our history with China in order to allow the West to, what did we do wrong? And you know the famous question that roams around, what went wrong? Bernard Lewis wrote a whole article, became what went wrong with Islam? My question is what went wrong with Europe? Europe is the one that created modernity as a traumatic reaction to the Catholic Church, and all the history of Europe by Europeans themselves will give you this narrative without a question. And so why are we asking what went wrong in the... No, that is a fundamentally problematic and wrong question to ask. What went wrong with China? They were empires. They were doing very well. And suddenly, Europe comes with its guns and demolishes them and decides that, well, it is Schubert and Chopin and Tchaikovsky are the ones to listen to, but not Kulthum or them. Kulthum becomes an ethnic music. But Beethoven is a universal music. What is this? It is the power of the gun being dictated in artistic words. So the art follows on the gun. So we have to recalibrate, as I said in the lecture, recalibrate all our questions. By merely shifting the question that I just did, what went wrong with, you are shifting the entire basis of scholarship. I saw several hands in the...
Yeah, we have time for just one more question, and then the Dean will come forward with his closing remarks, inshallah. Please.
مرحبا، عبد الرحمن المري من جامعة قطر. أعتقد دكتور حلاق بما أنك عرجت على مسألة تعميم الثقافة أو تعميم المنتجات الثقافية الغربية بصفتها ذات طابع عالمي، يسمح لي أن أقول أيضا أن هناك وقائع حصلت في 100 سنة الأخيرة، وقائع حصلت أصالة داخل النطاق الأوروبي مثل الحرب الغربية الأولى، هي يعني تسمى حرب عالمية أولى، ولكنها حرب وقعت داخل النطاق الأوروبي. وأعتقد بما أنك بدأت يعني استفتحت هذه المحاضرة يعني الخلاصة والخاتمة، أنا أيضا معني بالخواتيم لما تحمل هذه الخواتيم من المعنى الذي ينبغي الوصول إليه وينبغي تفعيله. يعني بداية أنا يعني صراحة بحاجة إلى الإشارة إلى أنكم أسهمتم إسهاما كبيرا في إدخال الشريعة عبر كتابكم الشريعة المنشور عام 2009، حيث أن يعني طوال العقود الماضية كانت الحداثة تعاني إشكالات نظرية عميقة، ويمكن أن نقرأ مدرسة فرانكفورت بما هي بوصفها مدرسة حاولت أن تستدرك على إشكالات الحداثة ذاتها وبأدوات حداثية أخفقت في جانب وأصابت في جوانب أخرى. فوكو ودريدا يعني حتى إدوارد سعيد في كتابه الاستشراق هو يحاول أن يستدرك على الإشكالات الحداثية من داخل المنظومة الحداثية، لكنكم بكتاب الشريعة قدمتم نموذجا خارج إطار الحداثة بصفته يحمل منظومة قادرة على أن تعالج الإشكالات الجذرية الثاوية في عمق هذه المنظومة. أنا حقيقة عندي يعني مجرد سؤال يبدو بسيطا لكن أعتقد أنه عميق يعني إلى درجة.
تفضل.
وهو إذا كانت الحداثة عاجزة، منظومة الحداثة عاجزة عن أن تعالج إشكالاتها من الداخل، وإذا كانت الحلول الوافدة إلى هذه المنظومة من الخارج حلول سواء كانت حلول نسبية أو حلول جذرية تبدو مستحيلة، لأن من يمتلك زمام القوة وهو الغرب، مع تحفظي على مفهوم الغرب، وهو تحفظ مسنود إلى أسس علمية، لأنه ليس يعني تصنيف جغرافي ولكنه تصنيف أيديولوجي يعني متهلهل إلى حد بعيد. فما هو الحل الممكن إذا كان الحل الأول غير مجدي، حل الحداثة من خلال أدواتها غير مجدي، وإذا كان الحل الوافد من خارج منظومة الحداثة حل يستحيل التسليم به واستعماله واستدخاله، فهل هناك حل بينهما معين؟
شكرا على هذا السؤال. سؤال مهم جدا، ولكن دعني أن أقول أن ليس هناك حل ثالث. إما الحل الأول طبعا مستحيل، لا تستطيع أن تعالج المرض من داخل الجهاز أو المنظومة التي خلقت المرض نفسها. وهذا المثال على الأنتي أسيد هو مثال فعلا أجده مقنع جدا. ولكن الطريقة الثانية هي الصحيحة، ولكن أنت تيأس من هذا، أنت نفسك. هذه مسألة اختيار شخصي. أنا رجل لا أؤمن بأن هناك في هذه المسائل أي شيء مستحيل، لأنه إذا قد نظرت إلى دخول أوروبا إلى الحداثة من خلال القرن الخامس عشر الرابع عشر، عندما بدأت تنمو نموا بسيطا وبدائيا، كانت في وضع أصعب نسبيا، أصعب مما نحن فيه الآن، لأن الآن القوى تنتشر في جميع أنحاء العالم. يعني قوة الإنترنت لوحدها قد تعطي من الأسلحة للمعارضة. انظر إذا كنت نظرت إلى غزة، ليس لديهم أي شيء، ولكن الكاميرا نفسها هي قوة. هذا لم يكن موجود في أوروبا في القرن الرابع عشر والخامس عشر. القمع كان قمع absolutist، يعني مطلق. ولكن انظر، من لا شيء أوروبا دخلت في الحداثة وهندست نفسها بشكل جديد، بشكل مختلف تماما من ما يسمى كيانا بربريا إلى أن ما يسمى حداثة. فكما دخلت أوروبا في الحداثة، سنخرج وسنساعد أوروبا وأمريكا أن تخرج من الحداثة إذا كنا زي ما نقول في فلسطين شاطرين.
Alhamdulillah, thank you very much. So now I would like to invite Dean Shenturk to come forward with some closing remarks.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am here to thank Her Highness, Her Excellency, our President, our colleagues, deans and professors, my colleagues from HBKU and outside HBKU. I see a very special audience here, and I thank our students to coming and sharing this important moment with us. And in particular, I thank Professor Wael Hallaq, my longtime friend and colleague. We share many ideas together with him, and I thank him for clearly expressing his ideas. And this is what I like, yani, standing firm, defending his ideas. This is intellectual identity, and this is intellectual independence. Al-istiqlal al-fikri. And every scholar needs al-istiqlal al-fikri, intellectual independence. So he's setting a good example for our students how to become a scholar and what does being a scholar mean. This intellectual independence makes your work effective and influential. People read it whether they like it or not. And this is what we appreciate, and I'm very grateful for him to coming over all the way from New York, and this is the first semester at Columbia University, and he's very busy, but we are very grateful for having him over here, and we are looking forward to seeing him more frequently here in our university to provoke more discussions and also make us questions many things that we take for granted. Thank you very much, Professor Hallaq, for coming over.